The Alabama Secretary of State oversees elections. Wayne Rogers is one of the 2026 candidates who wants to oversee Alabama's elections. He joins me now.
How you doing,
Wayne, thank you
Cameron?
so much for being on the program.
Glad to be here, man. And so excited to see you. How's everything?
Great. Thank you for being the first guest on this channel. And
Oh, I'm so
uh,
excited. It's such a great privilege for me to get to be here for the first as the first guest.
yes, and I'm going to tee off with the first question. What inspired you to run for this seat?
So I'm inspired to run for this seat because uh, basically because it does oversee elections. And I've been doing that. I've been involved in elections my whole life. And I've also wanted to be involved in elections even more than I have been. But the Secretary of State is the person who oversees all the probate judges in the state of Alabama, oversees elections, oversees the voter registrations for the entire state, oversees campaign finance for the entire state. And I have been involved in elections very intimately for the last 7 years, Cameron. I've been executive assistant to Sheriff Mark Petway in Jefferson County. And Sheriff Petway asked me to join his administration, partly to do elections. I've attended every election commission meeting in the county for the last 7 years. I've been intimately involved both from in the inside of the election and on the outside of the election. I've actually been the person who, people would come and turn their things into when you start to count the ballots and things like that. And then as Jefferson County chair for the Democratic Party over the last 4 or 5 years, I've also been the person who found poll watchers for all the 175 polling places in Jefferson County. So been intimately involved in elections for a long time. I should also say that there's a secondary part that the Secretary of State does that's really, really very important, and that is they oversee small businesses in the state of Alabama. Like when you file for incorporation, when you file an LLC, when you create a partnership, you file with the Secretary of State. And I represented small businesses across the state of Alabama for 30 years. I'm a lawyer by trade, spent a long time representing those folks. I've actually appeared in court on behalf of an Alabama-based small business in 66 of Alabama's 67 counties. And another part of what I want to do as Secretary of State is make things easier for small business, make the function of the office work really smoothly, and make things work for small businesses in Alabama.
That's great to hear your motivations and for running for this seat. I want to get into something that you talk about on your that you mentioned on your campaign website, just and fair administration of elections. You are running as a Democrat. The Secretary of State role is about you're supposed to oversee the election in a nonpartisan way.
Exactly.
Why run as a Democrat for a nonpartisan role?
Yeah. So yeah, and it actually is a partisan role. I mean, this of course this is by law of the state of Alabama. It is a partisan position. You run for it in a partisan way. I don't necessarily like that, Cameron. I'll tell you. As Secretary of State, I would advocate that this position be converted to a nonpartisan role. I think it would be better. Honestly, we also elect judges in the state of Alabama in a partisan way. That's silly. We should not do that. Judges should be nonpartisan. They should be elected in a nonpartisan fashion, as they are in 43 of the 50 states. Alabama is behind on that, and Secretary of State is a similar situation. The Secretary of State, Cameron, should be the scorekeeper. And I like to tell people, when I was about 5 years old, I loved to watch baseball with my granddad. And my granddad would ask me, we would watch the Braves together when I was a little kid, and the Atlanta Braves. And he taught me how to be a scorekeeper. He taught me how to just write down what's happening. You fill in the blank. And then when, we get to the late in the game, it'd be the eighth inning, and he'd say, hey, Wayne, look at your scorebook and tell me, what's Dale Murphy done the first 3 times he's been up to bat? I'd say, well, he grounded out to second the first time, he struck out the second time, he got a double the third time, that sort of thing. So I learned to keep score at a very young age. Eventually, I was a scorekeeper for the Thomasville High basketball team. Well, what is the Secretary of State, Cameron? The Secretary of State is the scorekeeper. And I like to tell a little story. When I was scorekeeper in high school, I was the official scorekeeper. As a high school kid, I was about 15 years old, but I'm the official scorekeeper for home games for Thomasville High. And we had a situation where our best player got what he thought was his 4th foul, but I knew from looking at my scorebook it was his 5th foul, and he was about to be disqualified and not get to play the rest of the game, and we were going to lose, and we did lose. But when I looked at that scorebook, Cameron, and saw that was his fifth foul, you know what I told him? I'm not going to cheat. My integrity is more important than winning this game. I'm going to make sure that I tell that guy, that's your fifth foul and you're out of the game. And that's what I would do as Secretary of State. Should it be a nonpartisan position? Absolutely. I think it should be. And I'm running as a Democrat because I am a Democrat, because I want people to understand that Democrats have something to offer to this state. But would I be very happy to run this office as a nonpartisan? That's what I will do. I will be fair to everybody. I'll be the scorekeeper. I'm not going to be a coach for one side or the other. I'm going to be the person who calls things as they happen. And there's only one set of facts. You can have different sets of opinion, but there's only one set of facts. And the Secretary of State's responsibility is to tell people what the facts are. And that's what I would do.
In a Republican stronghold like the state of Alabama, how are you going to persuade Republican voters to vote for a Democrat in a statewide race?
Yeah, it's not an easy thing to do. We know that. One of the things that my campaign is really emphasizing, Cameron, is that I'm a nice guy. That's if you meet 10 people who know me, and they're going to 9 of them are going to tell you one of the first things they're going to say is, "Well, he's just a nice guy." And so I want to run a nice guy campaign. Secretary of State for the state of Alabama is not something that ought to be super controversial. Like you said earlier, like I said earlier, it should be a nonpartisan position. Why do we have to say, well, because I'm team red or because I'm team blue, I'm going to vote for that team? Vote for the guy who has experience in elections, who has experience with small business, who knows what he's doing, who's going to be the person who says things the way they are, calls things the way they see them. Now, I have a lot of Republican friends, Cameron, really all over the state. Like I say, I've represented people all over the place. And I've been a Sunday school teacher my whole adult life. I go to church. I sing in the choir. You know, this is something that a lot of Democrats a lot of Republicans in Alabama don't really realize about Democrats is we're just your neighbors. We're the people, we live here. Now, I live in downtown Birmingham, but I grew up in a single-wide trailer out in Thomasville, Alabama. I grew up as I didn't know I was poor, Cameron, but I guess I was looking back on it. Always had plenty to eat. But we didn't have a whole lot of money. We didn't go on vacation very often. We didn't get to do a whole lot. Didn't get to travel very much. I just want to tell people Democrats are regular people. We're not the crazy folks that some people want to say that we are. And I like to be nice to everybody. My 2 opponents on the Republican side, I've met one of them, hadn't met the other one. She's nice as she can be. I think she's a good person. I think I'd be better at the job than she is because she doesn't have a lot of experience in elections. And I have a lot of experience in elections. But, I think one of the things I'm going to have to do is just tell people, look, there's no reason that this is such a partisan position. It's something that people ought to be able to do without having to be so partisan. And Republicans, you can vote for a guy like me who's just going to be a nice guy who knows what he's doing. I really have a lot of experience in this stuff, and I'll be really good at it.
On your campaign website, you talk about making voting a priority for every eligible voter. What is a concrete step you would take to make voting a priority for every eligible voter?
I'm so glad you asked that, man. This is my biggest idea. And the thing well, let me step back a little bit, Cameron. What I should say, people always want to say that Alabama's behind the country, blah, blah, blah. We're 49th in this and 44th in that, 43rd in this. There's a lot of things Alabama's actually led the country in. I mean, we led the country in mental health care, something I'm intimately involved in, and it's really, really close to my heart, Cameron, because a lot of folks in my family have suffered from mental illness over the years, and it's really close to my heart. We were the place where, a lot of people don't know this, but Alabama is the place where mental health was revolutionized. The way things used to be when people were kept kept in confinement for many, many years, for long decades, that ended in the state of Alabama. Of course, we know about Katzenbach versus McClung and the Civil Rights Act becoming real in the state of Alabama. So I've got a big idea here, Cameron. Do you know why we vote on Tuesdays as opposed to any other day of the week? Do you know why that is, Cameron?
You inform me.
Okay, I'll tell you. We vote on Tuesdays because back when 90% of the country were farmers in the early 1800s, early 19th century, market day was Tuesday. in most of the towns in America, market day was a day farmers brought their goods into market, and they would go to market on Tuesday morning. And so they set Tuesday as the voting day because market day would happen on Tuesday morning, and then they could vote on Tuesday afternoon. It makes no sense in a 21st century technocracy to vote on Tuesday. So one of the ways that I propose and plan to propose, now, again, I'm not going to be a king. I'm not going to be able to do this. I can't just implement this, wave a wand and say this is the way we're going to do it. This is what I'm going to advocate for. We should be voting on the weekend. We should have the polls open from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. on Saturday, close them at 8 p.m. Saturday night. We should open them back up on Sunday morning at 6 a.m. and close them at 8 on Sunday night. We should give folks 14 hours to vote on Saturday, 14 hours to vote on Sunday, total of a 28-hour voting period. I believe that would raise turnout in Alabama by 15 to 20% if we made that change. And instead of voting on Tuesday, we voted over a full weekend on Saturday and Sunday. Now, I even, when I said this, Cameron, I had some younger people say, "Hey, Wayne, why close the polls at 8 p.m. on Saturday night? Why just leave them open all night?" I'm like, hey, we can get poll workers to do it. That's not a bad idea either. Let's open the polls up on Saturday morning, 6 o'clock, close them at 8 p.m. on Sunday night. That's okay too. If somebody wants to come in at 1 a.m., 2 a.m., they're working that time. That's a good time for them to vote. Let's do it. I'm totally fine with that. Another thing I would advocate for, Cameron, it's another big idea. It's something a lot of Democrats have been talking about, and I think it ought to happen, is we need to lower the voting age. We need to lower the voting age to 17 or even to 16. When people can drive at 16, why can't they vote at 16? Should we have high school kids voting? They know what's going on in this country. They know more about it than a lot of older people do sometimes, because older people get set in their ways and only watch one kind of news. Young people probably know more about what's happening in the world than a lot of the older voters who tend to be the ones that vote all the time. So that's sort of my two big ideas. Let's lower the voting age. That gets more people out voting. And let's make sure we vote on the weekends where real live working people have more opportunity to vote. Because I will tell you, I know union members, I know service workers, I know folks who work in restaurants, folks who work in banks, folks who work in the service industry who do not vote because they can't get to the polls between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. on a Tuesday. So that's two of the things I would do, Cameron. I got a few other things that I have thinking about too, but I think that's probably the two boldest ideas that I've got.
What steps would you take to work with the state legislature and the governor to accomplish those goals?
I'm just going to draft a bill, which I'm very experienced at doing. I've drafted bills and sent them to the legislature for years. Bills that I've drafted have passed the legislature, and I know how to draft a bill. I would, of course, work with the Alabama Legislative Service, where I have some friends down there that have helped me draft bills before, and I would draft bills up and go to a legislator who is in. I know many legislators already, Democrat and Republican. They're all friends of mine. I have to work with all of them. You can't work in a Democratic administration in the state of Alabama and not have a Republican working with you. We need Republicans who help us to drive our bills through. We can't get our bills passed without their help, honestly. So I know those folks, and I would take that to someone who agrees with my bold idea and have them introduce it as a bill. I'd want to start it start in the House, start in the Senate. Doesn't matter because there's no money going out. We can start at either place. The bills that have money going out have to start in the House. But if you can start a bill like this, can start in either place. And I would throw those two out there. We would write, it'd be separate bills. It'd be one bill for the Saturday, Sunday voting and a separate bill to lower the voting age. So we would draft up bills that would amend the Alabama code to implement those changes. And then I would lobby and testify at hearings and talk to legislators and talk to the governor and talk to anybody else who might have any influence over this. Talk to the lobbyists who have a lot of influence in this state, way more than they really ought to. But I would talk to anybody who would listen about implementing those ideas.
In terms of promoting early voting, it does come at a fiscal cost. How do you assure those who are concerned about the fiscal cost associated with early voting?
You know what, man? It don't cost very much. I mean, Cameron, it's something that a lot of Alabamians don't really think about, but although we don't call it early voting, we do have absentee in-person voting for 6 weeks, a longer period than most states have. A lot of states have early voting that happens for 3 weeks or 4 weeks or 2 weeks or whatever. For us, we have a 6-week period before the election where you can vote absentee. And this is something that most Alabamians have no idea about, Cameron, but you can vote absentee in person. And if you're going to vote absentee in person, if you're going to vote absentee at all, I, as a voting rights advocate, as somebody who's seen elections, highly advocate that you do so. You know how you do it? You go to the clerk's office for your county. The clerk in your county has people there. They are mandated by law to have someone there for that entire 6-week period leading up to the election. Actually, you can't go absentee in person after the Thursday before the election on the following Tuesday. So 5 days before, they cut off absentee in person. But if you're eligible to absentee vote, you should go do absentee in person. The reason I say that, Cameron, is mail-in ballots, about 1 out of every 5, there's a defect in them. Now, we'll talk about that in a second, but there's a defect in about 1 out of every 5 that are mailed in because the person didn't get it notarized right. They didn't check the right box. They didn't put it in the envelope right. Any of those things, and that ballot gets disqualified. And when we finish counting in Jefferson County, there's a pile of those ballots sitting over in the corner every time. And it breaks my heart to see those ballots over there because those are people that tried to vote, did their best, and they didn't get to vote. But if you go do absentee in person, it's going to get counted because the folks at the clerk's office know what they're doing. They're going to make sure you fill out everything right. They're going to get the envelopes right. They're going to get the notarization right, and your vote's going to count. Now, when can somebody absentee vote in Alabama? If they're over the age of 60. Over the age of 70, they can automatically absentee vote. If they're going to be working 10 hours or more on election day and can certify to that, they can absentee vote. If they're going to be out of the state on election day, they can absentee vote. So although we don't have early voting, we have the structure already in place for people to early vote in the form of our clerk's offices. And it would not cost much at all just to expand that and say, you don't have to have an excuse. We did it in 2020 during the pandemic. We said anybody who could absentee vote. And you know what happened? Jefferson County, which had never had more than 10,000 absentee ballots cast, had 55,000 absentee ballots cast in 2020. We could have that number or more just by making absentee voting a little easier. And the structure doesn't have to change very much. You probably would have to hire 1 or 2 more people in the larger counties. In the smaller counties, I don't know that there's going to be any change at all to the infrastructure because the clerk's office already has people there, already able to do this work.
Just curious, I'm someone who follows politics, and oftentimes Secretary of State elections don't really get any press from the legacy media or even from independent media. Why do you think that is?
Because people don't think it's a very important spot, and it is an extremely important spot. Cameron, here's how important it is. Caroline Dobson, who is one of the Republican one of the Republican candidates for the Secretary of State nomination. Everybody should know that Wes Allen, the current Secretary of State, is going to run for Lieutenant Governor. He's not running for re-election as Secretary of State. So there are 2 announced Republicans in the race. Caroline Dobson is one of them. She's part of a billionaire family. So, Cameron, this position, I should just tell everybody, the salary for this position is $68,000 a year. Okay. That's what the Secretary of State makes. So obviously the state doesn't think it's a very important position because, there's a whole lot of people make more than $68,000 a year, but that's what the state pays the Secretary of State right now. Caroline Dobson considers this such an important position that she put $500,000 into her campaign the first day she announced she was running for this position. So in other words, 7 years worth of salary went immediately into her campaign when she announced for it. Now, does anybody think that the Republicans see this as an important spot? You better dang well believe they do. They know how important it is because this is the person who runs elections. And the person who runs elections as a Democrat, if we've got every other person in the state as a Republican office holder, I would oversee their elections and I can make sure they're not cheating the state, right? That's what we need, a Democratic eye, a Democratic voice in the administration or an independent voice. Say, if I get elected, maybe I'll come up there and say, well, look, I'm no longer a Democrat because I think this ought to be a nonpartisan position. Fine. I've been a Democrat my whole life, probably wouldn't do that. But if I did, what would it matter? This is such an important position and we need an independent voice overseeing this. Cameron, I should go back and say, she loaned or not loaned, she put into her campaign $500,000 of her own money. When the day I announced my campaign for Secretary of State, my wife and I put in $500 to our campaign, because that was, and honestly, that was probably a little bit larger percentage of our net worth than the 500,000 she put in is her net worth. But that's a totally different subject. But I think people don't realize the importance of the position, because they don't know. When you ask anybody out on the street who runs elections in Alabama, they ain't gonna know. They're going to say, well, maybe the governor does it. Does the attorney general do it? Does the Supreme Court do it? They don't know. The probate judges do it locally, but the Secretary of State oversees all of that. So it is a much more important position than the name implies, than people think, than people believe. And I'm trying to draw some attention to this position because it is such an important one across the state of Alabama. That's why I wanted to jump into this race early and tell people around the state, I'm running, and I will make sure you're not being cheated in elections, because, there are ways to cheat. And I'm going to make sure that those loopholes are closed and people don't get to cheat, and that that what the people want and what the people say gets carried out just like a scorekeeper does.
Before we end this interview, do you have any last words or thoughts you would like to share with the audience?
Absolutely, Cameron. Thank you for just asking that. So I want to tell a little story. So, like I said, I was a lawyer all over the state, represented small business, going here, there, and everywhere. On my 44th birthday, which I turned 63 2 weeks ago, so I'm 63 now. So this is 19 years ago. I was headed down to Dothan, Alabama, in a used car that I had bought about 2 months before this. I bought it back in July. It was a used Honda Civic. And I was driving from Birmingham to Dothan to appear on behalf of a small business in Houston County Circuit Court that day. So I get about to Montgomery, which is about halfway to Dothan from Birmingham. And I'd been listening to the radio. I had my air conditioning. It's still hot. September, it was still really hot. So it's September 18th. So I guess it was a month ago. But anyway, so I'm driving down there and my air conditioners, I'm listening to the radio, and I got to Montgomery and my radio started going out. And I was like, I wonder what's going on here. I don't know. So I get a little further down to Troy and my air conditioner started cutting off. It cut off and cut back on, cut off, cut back on. So I was like, this is really weird now. Something's going very strange here. So I get to Ozark and I'm going down the hill into Ozark, Alabama. If you ever go through Ozark, there's a big hill there. As I'm coming down that big hill, it started raining. Well, Cameron, you know what else is run by what my car was having a problem with? That would be the windshield wipers. So the windshield wipers went out in the middle of a driving rainstorm. So I drive on to Dothan. I'm sticking my head out the window to try to see. My defroster ain't working, because I, by this time, figured out what the problem was. The problem was not the engine. I made it all the way to Dothan. I appeared in court that day on behalf of my client. I won that case. But the engine was working fine. What wasn't working was the alternator. Cameron, voting is the alternator of society. Our engine still works fine. There's still power in the people. The people of Alabama still have a lot of power. We are able to vote on things we need to vote on. We still can elect the people we want to elect. But if we don't vote, it's like the alternator of democracy has gone out. You transform the power of the engine through an alternator into the windshield wipers and the radio and the air conditioner and all the things you need to be comfortable and need to be able to drive your car. And if that engine has all the power in there and they're not able to pass through the alternator and help you to run things in your car, things start to really be uncomfortable. And I think that's what we're seeing in Alabama right now. People have refused to vote. We just have a lot of people, and I shouldn't say refuse to vote. They don't think it's worth their time to vote. And I have a lot of people who are friends of mine. I know lawyers who don't vote. I know economists who don't vote. I know accountants who don't vote because they just don't think their vote means anything. And what we got to tell people is your voting is the alternator of society. You take that power that is resident in the people and you turn it into things that are usable for society when you vote. Is how you transform the power of the people into something we can use. into something that's important to us. A car without an air conditioner, without a radio, without windshield wipers, it's really hard to use. It'll still get you where you need to go. And that's what's happened in Alabama. We're still going down the road, but the people still have the power, but we aren't translating that power into the things that society needs. And I just think, I think we need to have more people. Like, I'll finish with this and say, people say, well, Republicans got a lot more votes than Democrats did in the election last year. But Cameron, who got the most votes? Nobody. There were more people who voted for neither Republicans nor Democrats in the United States of America last year than voted for either party. We need a much higher percentage of people to vote in this nation. We need a much higher percentage of people to vote in this state. Goodness sakes, 2 weeks ago we had a runoff election in Birmingham where the turnout was 7%. We've got to get our elections up. We haven't had an election with a turnout of over 70% in a very long time. So 30% of the people aren't voting. Last year, it was closer to 40% than it was to 30%. So we've got to get more people voting so the will of the people, that power that is resident in the people, is translated into things that the people need, like a better run Secretary of State's office that helps small businesses, like proper medical care for people, like proper hospitals that don't have to close down, rural hospitals that don't have to shut down because they don't have enough money and things like that. We need that in Alabama. We need it in America, and I'll be working for all of that.
Thank you for finishing this broadcast off with that story and talking about the importance of voting. Wayne, thanks again for appearing on the show, and best wishes to you down the line.
Thank you so much, Cameron. It's been great to be with y'all. Let me say my website is Wayne Rogers for AL Secretary of State, just AL, the abbreviation for Alabama, Wayne Rogers for AL Secretary of State.com. You can find me there. My email address there is Wayne Rogers for AL Secretary of State.com. You can find me on Instagram at Wayne for Alabama. You can find me on Facebook at Wayne Rogers for Secretary of State. I would love for anybody to follow us there and get involved in our campaign. And the last thing I'll say is 1 week from Monday, October 27th at 5 p.m., I'm having a campaign kickoff in Homewood, Alabama. It's 195 Vulcan Road. Anybody that wants to come, welcome to come out, have some food, have some drinks, and listen to some good music and hear a few speeches, including one from me. So thanks, Cameron. I appreciate it.
Great. Thank you, Wayne. And that's the end of the interview. Have a great day.
Thanks, man. You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.